Thank you so much for joining us in Africa Live, Mike. A considerable number of people derive their livelihood from buying and selling scrap metal, but now Kenya has put a freeze on this trade. Is this the right approach in dealing with vandalism of infrastructure components? Hi, Mike. Are you able to hear me? I was asking just about how there's a
Oh,
considerable number of people.
sorry, we certainly crossed lines there. Well, I'm not sure if it's the right approach or not, but if it's at least something has to be done, because just a day or so ago, South African Railways lost 31 kilometers of cable in one day. That's very difficult to replace over a period of time, but in one day to lose 31 kilometers of cable is very much a big problem. It stops trains, etc. We also have the same problem as you guys in terms of electricity theft. We have cables stolen from our major electricity distributor, Eskom, and the big cities that distribute electricity. We have transformers where the oil is tapped out of. So it is a huge problem. And it obviously does economic damage, because if you don't have electricity, you often cannot work because you might not have a generator that lasts very long, or an inverter. And then on the railway side, we know that just on one corridor, the coal corridor, we call it, down to Richards Bay, we've lost 30 billion rand worth of exports. That's approximately $2 billion worth of exports lost in a few months of coal. And that's something like an economy like South Africa cannot afford. So we have to go and look how we can stop this trade. And one of the ways, obviously, is to look at the second-hand scrap dealers and allowing exports of scrap. One has to be very, very careful.
And I suppose those numbers that you mentioned could be coming from any country, worldwide, and especially here on the African continent, and it can be related to what's happening here in Kenya, just in terms of loss to the economy. But what needs to be done, Mike, to have that balance between saving the economy and all the impact that happens because of this, and also securing jobs and supporting economic activities at the same time that center around scrap metal while securing vital installations? How do you balance all those things together?
Well, you have to prosecute, you have to find the evidence, and you have to bring it to a stop. It's very simple in that sense. It's obviously much harder to do. And I'm sure all economies in the world will try to put a stop to it. But the levels that it reaches, maybe governments must call it terrorism, or attacking infrastructure, and have special laws or enforcement on it. Because at this moment in time, we haven't really caught the main perpetrators in South Africa. I'm not sure how you're doing in Kenya, but it's very harsh on the African continent. We don't have major rivers like Europe, which could be used as an alternative to, for example, export coal or import products into the interior. We have to rely on railway lines and road networks, and they again in turn rely on electricity very often. It would be a major catastrophe for Nairobi or Johannesburg to have all the outages, and then the robots that you have that don't work and so on. Here in South Africa, we do have from time to time large areas that are without electricity because of load shedding. And we sometimes have the police directing the traffic and sometimes not. And you can imagine what that does to your time to get to work. Instead of taking, say, half an hour or three-quarters of an hour to get to work, it doubles that time very easily. And the productivity and the economy gets lost. So normal people are under pressure. They spend more on fuel. They spend more time in their cars. It's a huge problem, and the firms don't get the productivity that they need. It is really concerning that this is happening in more than one or two African countries. That is really, really concerning to hear.
Mike, thank you so much for staying with us in Africa Live. Let's just continue that conversation on what you think authorities in South Africa should do to weed out criminal elements from ventures that are dealing with scrap metal.
Well, the first thing we can do is probably inspect scrap metal dealers, see where they get their scrap from, whether it's legit or not, because there's ways and means of tracking that. And if you see large amounts of scrap metals with dealers that certainly doesn't look like it's legal, then that would have to be prosecuted. And those rules must be laid out quite clearly to that industry so that they know what they're dealing with. Then I think, that's the easiest way to do it. The second way is to look at the exports of scrap metal, because normally it's not the African countries that are refining or smelting that metal on large scale. So that normally leaves the continent, and that is something that needs to be investigated, where it goes to, and you'll probably need some sort of undercover operation for that. And it will have to be investigated quite thoroughly. But the other thing is, I'm not always sure if we have all the penalties in line here in South Africa. I'm not sure about Kenya because I don't know your law, but I think that's one of the things that we need to sharpen up on, because it's hurting the economy, it's hurting jobs, as you said, and it really is hurting the average man in the street. Africa should be a lot richer, and this sort of criminal activity takes away from growth, it takes away from the citizens of our continent, and it makes us poorer as a whole. It might enrich a very few illegitimately, if I can call it that, and it certainly needs to be followed up. I'm not always convinced our law enforcement agencies are doing enough, and we need to really push as citizens to have that investigated a lot more, and certainly to see a lot more arrests.
Thank you so much for all that. Mike Schussler speaking to us from Johannesburg, South Africa.